thank you both for your thoughts. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about who exactly is a civilian, particularly considering how armed conflict may have changed since the Geneva Conventions were initially signed, given the rise of interstate conflict and guerrilla warfare, terrorism, use of children as combatants, although I guess that probably hasn't changed that much, unfortunately. So my question to you is whether you think this concept of who in fact does count as a civilian is sufficiently kind of fleshed out in the law, whether it needs to be fleshed out further, or whether when you're on the battlefield you kind of know it when you see it.
Thank you. Second question or comment? Sir.
Good evening to all. My name is Sandeep. Sir, I would like to know that sometimes international law works in a watertight compartment and we do not have relaxations once we apply or ratify certain treaty on international law.
Do not have?
Pardon?
Do not have what?
So sometimes there is no relaxations once we accede to any treaty or ratify any treaty. So on this issue today we have the discussion over protection of civilian in armed conflict and other emergencies. So armed conflict, when it is non-international armed conflict, we have certain, say like the rights, and say we have to give certain rights to the occupants, the persons or the groups who are occupying the territories in the India. So we do not give it a status of non-international armed conflict because they will get the status of or the right of self-determination. They will be entitled for certain others, humanitarian and human rights. International movements will be there. There may be, say like the interference from certain other states in the sovereignty of the countries. So the problems of the Naxalites and the Maoist groups, basically the large-scale terrorist groups in the country. So if we declare it as a non-international armed conflict, what will be the repercussions on the sovereignty of the country and the policy makings and the decision making of the country? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Sir, to the back.
I have a foghorn voice. I don't need a mic. General Nambiar, you made some very interesting comments, and I'd like to perhaps get your views on the resolution of March 2013 of the Security Council of Resolution 2098, which has created an intervention force in the DRC, which is no longer just peacekeeping, but is basically has words such as neutralize in its mandate against armed opposition groups. Now, its implications for the peacekeepers now to be directly involved in a conflict, more than its traditional role of peacekeeping, the legal implications for the application of IHL to the UN peacekeeping forces itself, and the ambit of words like neutralize. All this, given your experience, especially in the former Yugoslavia, where clearly it was a snake pit in terms of the diplomatic games at play, but you as force commander clearly were hamstrung. But here the force is being given extra powers, and the European Court has attempted to put a brake on this in terms of the UK decision against the UK government in Al Jeddah, where it said that it cannot have internment as a policy in terms of peace, the UK forces operating under the Security Council mandate. So I'd like your views first on MONUC in particular, the intervention brigade in particular.
Thank you very much for the first round of 3 questions. The questions are posed to all panelists. Panelists, you are invited to answer the questions. And as moderator of this session, I give a caveat that panelists can go as far as he or she chooses on answering the question, given, of course, the various sensitivities of the situations in which we work and the nature and purpose of this event. Panelists.
I will just answer your first question with regard to the definition of civilian, and that too in very legal and very generalized terms. I leave it to General Nambiar to handle it more explicitly, as well as the other 2 questions. In law, law is not static. and definitions and law evolve, keeping in view the needs of the community and the society. So the definition of civilian will also have to evolve, keeping in view the requirement of the situation. It cannot remain static.
Thank you. First, let me make this point, which you talked of Lakhdar Brahimi and his report and all that. Now, Lakhdar obviously based his report after a lot of interaction with guys like us who fed it into the system with based on our own experiences. And I know him very well. I think his report is still very much valid and applicable. Unfortunately, like all good things, you find new reports coming up. They just use a lot of different language, but the content by and large remains the same. So I still value Lakhdar Brahimi's report very much. I think it gives some good lessons. But on this protection of civilians, all that if you notice in my talk, I didn't say protection of civilians. I said protection of innocent civilians. Because in my view, for a peacekeeper, it makes a lot of difference, because there are other civilians, not so innocent. And so that, I think, is the first point. But the more important one, in context of the question you've raised, is that I don't think sitting here or in New York or in Geneva, we should try to formulate what exactly the connotations are. I'm afraid you'll have to leave it to the guy on the ground. Leave it to his good sense, because these situations are normally dealt with. I'm talking of peacekeeping, but even otherwise, even in armed conflict, are at pretty low levels. You don't have a big, certainly not a lawyer, isn't it? In fact, I'm always at a disadvantage at these ICRC gatherings, because they're also full of lawyers that one is intimidated. But even so, as I said, the guy on the ground has to take a decision. And therefore, his shall we say, training and motivation and all that is what goes into the decision that he takes on the ground. Whether that's, that group of civilians are really innocent, firstly, and secondly, of course, if they are under his charge, protecting them is his job. He has to do it. There's no question about it, at the risk of his own life or the lives of the personnel he's in command of. But otherwise, there would be chaps otherwise, even civilians who are, at the drop of a hat, they'll use a weapon against you. You don't know whether he's got a weapon or not. So I'm afraid it will be very difficult for any organization to sit down. I do know they try, in the UN also. Sitting in New York, they try to frame all these rules. But for us practitioners, it is not only inhibiting, but I think it's not fair, because sitting there they can't make it. Even as a force commander, I often had to, and not often, most of the time, I had to depend on the judgment or the decision taken by the man on the ground. And I think we as commanders owe it to them to back them up if their decision is taken, in good faith, as it were. Okay, that's the answer I would suggest to you. Second point was about, what was it? Non-international. I'm not greatly qualified to speak on it, because, as I said, I'm not a lawyer. But as a military man who's had experience of just under 40 years in Indian Army uniform and operated in counterinsurgency situations and all that, I would say that the applicability doesn't change, even in situations. In fact, if anything, more so. For particularly, I won't talk of the rest of the world, but let us say the Indian Army is operating in the Northeast or in Jammu and Kashmir. After all, you're dealing largely with your own misguided countrymen. So you obviously have to be much more. You can't treat them as an adversary in war or something like that. So the whole approach has to be that, and I would suggest that most of us are, I think we have that much of sense, that much of dedication to make the difference and apply it reasonably well. Here again, I'm not too sure that it can be formulated as a sort of a statute or something like that. The question that you raised about intervention force, now that is obviously a subject of much discussion now. And first let me take you back a bit in history. In the early 1960s, if you recollect, the the Congo situation evolved, and a UN force was deployed at that time. I think it was called ONUC or something like that. And India had contributed 2 successive brigades to that mission. And the first brigade, I think it was, had to undertake combat operations against mercenaries led by Mose Shwambe. Okay? And they undertook combat operations to deal with those mercenaries. And if I'm not wrong, we suffered about 36 or 37 fatal casualties. Now that is a lot to suffer in a UN peacekeeping operation. In fact, one of my colleagues from my days in the academy was awarded the Parambir Chakra for that operation. He died in that operation, Captain Salaria. But it is, as I said, so the use of force in a UN peacekeeping operation, most people now, portray it as some new thought or something like that. When it has to be done, it has to be done, provided the mandate allows it and the guys on top politically support it. But this particular point about this intervention force that has now been mandated and all that has its own problems, because when you have an intervention force and a force that is not using, trying to manage things with sort of nice, kind words and all that, it's not always easy, because the belligerent couldn't care less whether he just sees your helmet and says, this is a UN guy. Now, he doesn't know whether he's the guy who's used the force or not used the force. So this is the aspect which is now a subject of much discussion, I would imagine, among the troop contributor nations, including India. And it will have to be seriously discussed and evaluated to see how this sort of thing. This particular force in the Congo, I think, it somehow seemed to have worked, but not because of its own efforts. It's more because of circumstances that led that. What was that grouping called? That what rebels were there? The M23 or whatever they were. Finally, they got round to the negotiating table and things quietened down. But it's not something which can be, shall we say, set aside. It's a useful complement to a mission, to the commander of that mission, when you have to deal with chaps who are, shall we say, placing the lives of innocent civilians at risk, and you need to use force. Then I think it's there. So the content, the mandate, the rules of engagement will have to be clearly worked out. That would be my thing. I don't know. Yeah, I think that, by and large, I think somewhat tried to answer your question.
If I may do a supplementary quickly.
Sorry?
If I may do a supplementary quickly, basically to press you on the issue, on whether you would go back to then making sure that the UN itself is signatory to the IHL for its own personnel.
When I was at the UN?
No, not when you were at the UN. Whether you would support in the context of the intervention brigade, the UN itself being a signatory to IHL, because it is now it is directly now a party in the conflict.
You see, this is what I'm saying. In my talk, I clearly, the UN as a signatory, I don't think has worked out yet, because they say that as an organization, they cannot take or enter into this sort of thing. But the applicability of the law is without question, because the troops who are participating are from nations who have signed up to the thing. So therefore that is where I think the training and equipping them with the knowledge of this has to be much more than even in our national environment. And which I think is done, because my own experience is that they respond and they take the right action, by and large. You might find the odd instance where things, and after all, the intervention force also is with a purpose. It's not just for, I think. See, the trouble with this Congo experience, I tell you, I mean, I visited the Congo for another purpose, and I know what goes on there in some ways, but I have not operated there, never been in commando forces there or something like that. The problem with the Congo operation is that part of the problem are the government forces. You see, your whole concept of impartiality and all goes for a six when the government forces in whose support the UN is deployed, are themselves responsible for some of the actions or atrocities against civilians. That is what makes the situation in the Congo a little more, and it would happen in other countries also if you are not careful. So that's the best answer I can give you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the panelists, for completing round one of the questions. Perhaps in abuse of my role, I would also add that the concept of this innocent civilian perhaps can be understood in light of the ICRC's interpretive guidance on direct participation in hostilities. Okay. Of course, this comes from the whole IHL understanding that it applies to those, it protects those who do not or no longer participate in hostilities. And I would encourage and invite participants to look at the interpretive guidance, which of course is persuasive, not binding, but it creates three distinct but complementary requirements for someone to lose protection under IHL, which includes that a threshold of harm having to be met, a direct causation element, and a belligerent nexus, which perhaps will give legal rationale to the concept of an innocent civilian or not. Taking it further, the last point, this is very much discussed around the table of states and the ICRC in its compliance mechanism of international humanitarian law. Should there be a meeting of states party to the Geneva Conventions, and should there be other organizations present to be part of this process, to contribute to discussion on compliance, but also to be subject to a discussion on compliance on itself. So this is an ongoing discussion which will be concluded in time for the 32nd International Red Cross Red Crescent Conference taking place in December 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, we will open up the floor to a second round and perhaps a final round of questions. The mic is open. Sir, the mic is yours.
Justice Mittal, this question is addressed to you for your comments. The superior courts in India have been very good in terms of getting international law recognized in the application of a range of issues, starting from apparel export promotion to Visaka, your own judgments, to a number of other judgments. However, when it comes to armed conflict, especially in the internal variety, there is a certain Rubicon that they don't cross. I refer to Salvador in particular. But in spite of the specific directions to disband the Salvador by the Supreme Court, the state government in question has basically popped a snoop at the court by just reappointing them as all as special police officers, which of course the law allows, but doing the same things they did as they were doing the Salvador. So it was just a merry-go-round as far as the civilian was concerned. He still faces the brunt of this kind of militia, which acts with a certain sense of impunity, which is difficult to understand, given the broad liberal attitude that the superior courts have shown.
You know, you've not asked a question, you've made a comment.
No, I'm asking you for your...
And I'm happy you made a comment and didn't ask the question. No, again you're asking what will be the remedy. It's the implementation of the court's order. If there's a violation, there is a remedy. We have a statute. You will proceed under the Contempt of Courts Act. And what you've just said here, you could say so in a petition. But I don't know what your question is there. You're actually saying people are violating with impunity. You see, the court can't run a police force to see where its orders are being enforced or not. Somebody has to take it before them.
Well, we will take that submission as a comment and a response to the comment and open the floor to ma'am.
Ma'am, I have a question for you. ICRC is working with various countries. Is there a possibility that these countries' judges come together and make a law for people who are suffering, especially women and children, that they have a law to migrate to another country and bring back their life to normalcy, and not suffer being there to wherever they are suffering. Could that be a possibility?
Judges unfortunately don't make the law, they implement it or interpret it. The law has to come from all of you.
All right.
Thank you. And the final opportunity for a question or comment.
I would like to, if I may, take advantage of your extensive experience, sir, to ask you specifically about the training that you've witnessed of the armed forces. Do you feel as if the training that is given to new recruits when they come into the forces equips them well enough to make these very important decisions we trust them with? And do you feel that there's any particular knowledge gaps that they could be supported to expand the training?
The question about general training or training of peacekeepers?
Training in general, training of the armed forces to implement IHL.
Is that okay? Yeah, well, there is, in fact, we just had, I think, Mr. Arya sitting here, who is part of the ICRC setup. They go around the country apprising the forces about the provisions of international humanitarian law. And insofar as that's the ICRC's sort of contribution to it. But in all our training institutions, the Geneva Conventions and in particular the provisions of international humanitarian law are part of the syllabus in all the courses of instruction that are run at our various training institutions. And these are by and large sort of conveyed to the commanders, that is officers, junior officers, senior officers at various levels, and who in turn are required to provide, to train their own. I mean, every individual may not be directly exposed to a, shall we say, a detailed explanation of that, but his commander at various levels apprises him of the provisions. And one of the, of course, great advantages, particularly as far as I can speak for the Indian Army, is that because most of our operations are undertaken with officers in charge, so the guys are better equipped than if the officer was not present with the group and therefore is able to implement the provisions. But the training is very, very, certainly very extensive. And insofar as peacekeeping operations are concerned, it's even more, I think, sort of, shall I say, intense. And I say this with some because I set up a center for UN peacekeeping here in Delhi about 14 years back in September 2000, and it's going strong. The ICRC sends their representative to speak at the various courses that are conducted. So there is a lot of thing, and the consciousness is there. I mean, besides our innate, understanding of what is right and what is wrong, it is the provisions are, well explained to our commanders and the troops.